National Park Service logo. Roosevelt Vanderbilt National Historic Sites logo. Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt sitting in a chair on the lawn. Title: Growing Up Roosevelt Grandchildren.
This film explores the different perspectives and experiences that Curtis and David Roosevelt had while growing up as grandchildren of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. What was fascinating was how different their experiences were and the roles they each played in the family. The gap in their ages, which was 12 years, was one of the reasons for those differences. Curtis was born in 1930 and lived in the White House with his grandfather and grandmere, and recalled many experiences he had during those formative years. So, his memories of his grandparents were strong, especially of FDR. For David Roosevelt, who was born in 1942, who would be just 3 years old when FDR died in April 1945, and did not have as much time to form that bond with his grandfather. By the time Curtis was 15 years old, FDR had been President of the United States for 12 years, and by the time he was 18, Eleanor would be working at the United Nations, pushing for the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In contrast, Curtis was accompanying Eleanor to Paris for the meeting of the UN. David is spending time as a 6-year-old boy at Valkill Cottage, Eleanor's home in Hyde Park, New York, and has fond memories of that wonderful place, and recalls the experiences he had of an older, confident, and more established woman that his grandmere became. Both recall the love and joy they felt from their grandparents, from the loving feeling of family at the holidays, to the many trips they took, to just spending time with their grandparents. This film will chronicle some of those experiences that Curtis and David enjoyed with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Curtis
and David Roosevelt and their experience they had growing up as grandchildren of Eleanor Roosevelt would be quite different. For Curtis and David, as well as many of the other grandchildren of Eleanor Roosevelt, or grandmere as they called her, she would be the most important person in their life. The two of them also expressed that feeling of love and admiration in different ways. Curtis writes in his book, Upstairs at the Roosevelts, Growing Up with Franklin and Eleanor, I am quite frank about the elements of Eleanor's personality that were a burden to me, particularly her persistent hostility toward my father. Her rigidity was practically ideological. But any criticism I make in no way detract from my love and admiration for my grandmother. She was undoubtedly the most significant person shaping my life. For David Roosevelt, who was 12 years younger than his cousin Curtis, has his own memories of his grandmother. David was only 3 years old when Eleanor Roosevelt leaves the White House in 1945 after FDR's death and was no longer the First Lady. He also had not lived with his grandparents at the White House as Curtis had done, so of course that viewpoint will be different. David states in his book, Grandmere, A Personal History of Eleanor Roosevelt, Grandmere was always attentive and warm, no matter the visitor, and always seemed to have time for us. I was aware that Grandmere was an important person, but to me she was just Grandmere. David continues, that Eleanor's nickname for me was Little Cowboy, or Little Texas, because of my penchant for wearing cowboy boots and shorts, which were my favorite attire as a small child. When it comes to Curtis and David Roosevelt's memory of their grandfather, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was pretty one-sided. What I mean is that Curtis grew up with FDR while living in Washington, D.C., in the White House, as well as at Springwood in Hyde Park, New York. Curtis would not only remember FDR as a historical figure, but had that personal connection with his grandfather that David was unable to experience because he's just 3 years old when FDR died in 1945. Many memories that David Roosevelt recounts are family stories, or research he did of his family. David writes, although I was too young to have really known my grandfather, my memories being those of a 3-year-old, others of my generation had the opportunity. Photographs of FDR or Papa with his grandchildren and recollections of elder siblings and cousins make it clear that he loved having us around. One well-known photograph taken at the White House at his 4th inaugural shows him with 13 of us, a cousin and me sitting on each knee. For Curtis, the experience was more personal. He recalls in the book Too Close to the Sun that grandfather
Two
always
images
waited for
of
the
a very
arrival
tired
of my sister and me,
and older Franklin
Sisty
Roosevelt.
and Buzzy. We entered boisterously to be greeted with equal noise by our grandfather and the group standing around his simple double bed. There he lay, propped up with lots of pillows, usually wearing an
Images of
old
black and
nondescript
white
pullover
comic
sweater.
strips.
When Sis and I entered, the work stopped. It was our turn with the boss. We hopped onto Papa's bed, one of us on either side of him. My grandfather seemed to savor the few minutes of silliness with my sister and me as much as we did, and the staff were free to join in the fun. Papa often read the funnies out loud, an entertainment enjoyed by us children and the adults alike. As you can see, despite the difference in their experience, David and Curtis could feel the love of their papa.
A woman with short hair smiling.
It comes a time in
as
everyone's
pictures being
life
taken.
that you will make a
Anna,
fool of
Curtis
yourself
Roosevelt's
or embarrass
mother.
yourself in front of your grandparents. Curtis and David Roosevelt would not be the exception to that rule. Curtis recalls his first memory of putting his foot in his mouth as a young kid. My grandmother picked up my mother and Missy, FDR's secretary, from FDR's study. They proceeded upstairs, gathered around my bed, each intoned her wish that I should sleep well, kissed me, and then returned downstairs. It was in front of this delegation that I would embarrass myself. I remember it this way. As Missy leaned over to kiss me good night, I noticed that she had a little dark fuzz on her upper lip. And when she bent over to kiss me good night, I took it into my head to announce, "Missy has a mustache." Nobody knew quite what to say, and there was embarrassment all around. Dave recalls a moment that as grandchildren we all have done,
in the background.
walking or running into a room unannounced on our grandparents. For many, that would have meant getting in trouble, but for David, he paints a different picture. I loved playing outside for hours at Valkill as a young boy. Eventually, I would tear through the house at great speeds to get to her bathroom, usually the closest to whatever I might be at the time
Eleanor's
of
office
virgin
with her
discovery.
desk, a blue
Racing through the
couch in
study
front
where
of it,
Grandmere might
a
be
Chinese
quietly
chest
working with Tommy,
with
her secretary,
wood paneling around
or
the
later
room.
on Maureen Core, or just meeting with important people. It seems I always waited until the very last minute to make that urgent mad dash. She never scolded me or grew agitated in the very least by the carrying-ons of her grandchildren, despite the fact that there were often many of us causing utter chaos. Of course, I am certain even we could push the limits of her patience, but perhaps I have just forgotten those rare moments.
Eleanor Roosevelt
Curtis and
walking
David
in front
would
of the
take
Eiffel
many
Tower
trips with their
in Paris
grandmere.
with two men on a sidewalk.
In 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt would be in Paris trying to get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed. She would take 18-year-old Curtis Roosevelt with her. As Curtis recalls, I had known for many years that my grandmother was a political pro, but it was at the United Nations in Paris in 1948 that I realized just how seasoned a professional she was. I listened while she discussed tactics with her advisors and with other UN delegates with whom she worked closely. My grandmother
Eleanor
performing the
Roosevelt
gracious
sitting
hostess in
at the
Paris
UN
was hardly new
with
to me.
headset on.
Her manner, warmth, and innate kindness had always been her trademark, but in Paris it was different. There she was truly focused, and I might even say unusually calculating. Simultaneously hostess and political pro, she honed in on exactly what she wanted to accomplish. Get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed at the General Assembly, which she did. What I took away from this trip was my grandmother's attitude, her passion coupled with her
Eleanor
political
Roosevelt
savvy,
sitting on her couch
both
in her
blended
living room
her
with a
will to
tapestry
achieve.
behind her on the wall, and
I was
Franklin
asked once,
Roosevelt's picture over her right
what
shoulder.
was it like to be in my grandmother's company? I thought about it and
Roosevelt standing
answered,
on a porch with his
I've been in her
grandparents
company all my
when he
life.
was 8,
It was
and
an
now when
education,
he's older.
I said, or something like that, a rather lame reply. For David Roosevelt, his trip was a bit closer to home. He recalls, I would
A
go
brick
for
building
walks
with
with
7
Grandmere
windows,
if I
with
wanted
white
to talk about
shutters and a
something
front
special,
door, the Hyde
where
Park
she would
post
often
office.
invite me to go with her to run errands in the village of Hyde Park. We would go to the post office or grocery shopping, and the local people would always greet her with, "Good morning, Mrs. R." or Mrs. Roosevelt.
Green grass.
To
and
me,
trees
Valkill was
with
a
the
wonderful
leaves,
place.
looking at a stone house.
It was a paradise with few rules. Many have asked me,
David
what was
Roosevelt
Eleanor
sitting on a
like?
tan couch
When
in
I
his
think
living
about my
room.
answer, really, she was Grand Mayor. In my life, it was Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy that was passed to me that inspired me in my own life and giving, that compelled my interest and professional path of helping others.
Images of the works cited for the pictures in the film. Roosevelt, Vanderbilt, and National Historic Sites logo. National Park Service logo.